Update.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. It's episode 151. Today I'm going to focus on plantation forests versus natural forests. What's the difference? Why do we care? What's important? And more importantly, how are some plantation forests slowly becoming naturally occurring forests? I've also got some great questions about some plantation species of wood, which is what really inspired this episode. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the varieties of teak that are out there from both natural and plantation forests as a way to kind of illustrate the definitions of natural versus plantain forest. I've got some more questions about bugs, specifically some confusion on air drying lumber and bugs. And I want to talk a little bit about drying much larger timbers as well. So we're here to talk about wood, answer some questions about wood, but also take a little bit of feedback about wood. I'm Shannon Rogers, your resident wood nerd and host of this show. And as always, I'm happy to receive your questions, happy to get your feedback. If you have listened to a previous episode and you're like, hey, that's not right, or I'm surprised you didn't talk about, this, then please send in those questions, send in that feedback. If you go to lumberupdate.com, there's a contact form there. You also can just email me directly, lumberupdate@gmail.com. You can even track me down on Instagram @lumberupdateshow and submit a direct message that way as well. Of course, if you are interested in the show and sponsoring the show, go to patreon.com/lumberupdate. And if you sponsor the show, you can get a chance to get stickers, both Lumber Update stickers, featured species stickers. But more importantly, if you ask questions, pretty much guaranteed they're going to get bumped to the front of the line. But I wanted to kind of focus first on some feedback. I got an outstanding email from a gentleman named Chris, who is I think he calls himself a high-end trim carpenter. He says, I just wanted to leave a comment about southern yellow pine being used as a construction material. I completely understand the giddiness. It's probably an accurate adjective there. The giddiness over the possibility of all the untapped resources in the U.S. However, as a carpenter, I find that southern yellow pine is a terrible, terrible framing wood. It's too heavy and too brittle. It doesn't take screws well at all, and it will split 9 times out of 10 when attempting any angled screws. The weight is the kicker, though. Imagine you're a carpenter that has to deal with 200 to 300 studs a day at a minimum. The added weight of southern yellow pine as opposed to common whitewoods means that you have much more added stress on your body 200 to 300 times a day. Multiply this by someone's career, and you have something that is untenable and will cause more fatigue, more injuries, and lesser quality work. It is probably inevitable that we move to southern yellow pine, but it needs to be noted that on the industry side, the actual guys who are doing the work are all opposed to it. It's only the builders and industry professionals who don't ever lift a finger who are really interested in it. Yeah, it's a really good point, Chris. I appreciate that. He goes on to say, it's very convenient for someone who never has to pick up a board to say that the weight is a non-factor. I began noticing this last year at a local Lowe's near Asheville, North Carolina, that we were unable to buy whitewood 2x6s and up, and instead could only buy southern yellow pine. The difference in hoisting a 2x10 joist made out of southern yellow pine and the same 2x10 in a whitewood is unbelievable. Tasks that 2 men could perform now need to be performed by 3. In an industry that is plagued by labor shortages, we are moving in the wrong direction and we're killing our workforce as well. Just wanted to keep this in mind as discussion continues around southern yellow pine. I think this is outstanding. A lot of these conversations that I have on the show, that I have in the day-to-day, that you read about in articles, they talk a lot about the technical properties of the wood and the availability and the sourcing and the environmental concerns about it. But where the rubber meets the road, or where the hammer meets the nail in this case, is something to be really considered. And while I might take some exception to the hard to work side of things, I'm not going to deny that it is, air quotes, harder to work than some of the whitewood. It's just different. I've run into this in the siding market, in the high-end kind of luxury home siding market that has been siding their homes in Western red cedar cladding for decades. And now many builders are moving on to other hardwoods specifically, and sometimes exotics. African sapele is a major player in the solid wood siding market. And people continue to have problems with sapele because they were able to get away with so much with Western red cedar. The very soft nature, compressible nature of Western red cedar means that you can kind of muscle it into place with fasteners. You don't have to worry about movement as much. You can drive a lot of different fasteners without pre-drilling and without worrying about splitting. Whereas something like sapele does require pre-drilling, does require sometimes specialized fasteners. You got to pay a lot more attention to wood movement because the sapele will muscle those fasteners out of the way. And I've had people complain about how sapele is a terrible wood and it works horribly and it splits 6 ways to Sunday. And ultimately, yeah, that's true if you use the same construction techniques that you were using for that softer Western red cedar. So Chris, totally, you got way more experience nailing up and standing up framing than I ever will have. So I'm going to take your word for this, but I also encourage you to, before you immediately say this is a terrible wood to work with, step back and assess how can I change how I'm working with it. Now, what that usually means is you got to slow down and you have to maybe pre-drill and things like that, which can be really expensive. Time is money, right? And that's why whitewoods will probably continue to be a strong player because you don't have to be as careful. You can get away with a lot more. But the weight issue, honestly, that's something that I never really thought of other than just a technical data point. Moving and slinging studs around, and specifically not just studs, but your larger framing materials. And as we see more and more passive house construction happening where 2x6s are being used as studs to provide a deeper, greater insulation barrier wall, now you're slinging 2x6s and 2x8s all day long, and you're right, that is going to destroy your body over time. So thank you again for pushing in that question. It's really something that I'm guilty of not actually thinking about as someone who sells the lumber but is not actually, sticking up houses. It's really important. Will wrote in response to my last episode on hickory. He said that I've been playing drums for over 25 years. Hickory has always been the go-to choice for drumsticks. Years ago, I discovered Shirakashi oak sticks. I grabbed a pair, fell in love because they are more durable. Hickory sticks would fray and chip out somewhat easily, but the oak sticks basically dent, so they last longer. After a while, though, I noticed the oak sticks bothering my carpal tunnel because, you guessed it, no shock absorbent properties. Back to the hickory I went. A buddy of mine recommended Peo Mark's fire grain hickory sticks, which are Shishugibon burnt and are way more durable than normal hickory. Great episode. Thanks for doing the podcast. And I got a couple other emails from people saying, I'm surprised you didn't bring up drumsticks as a common use for hickory. Well, I didn't bring it up because I didn't even think about it. I'd never even thought about that. I am in no way, shape, or form a drummer. Percussion is the dark arts to me as a vocalist and piano player. Never really paid much attention to it. But I asked several friends of mine who are drummers, and unanimously, they all said, heck yeah, I use hickory drumsticks. They commented similar to what Will said, where they don't tire you out as much, but you also can get a slightly different sound from a hickory drumstick. Who knew? But we talked a lot about the great shock absorbent and bending strength and that little bit of whip at the end of an axe swing. Same type of thing is going on even on a small scale of drumsticks. So awesome. I learned something new today that I didn't know about hickory, and now I love hickory even more. Moving on, I've got a little bit of industry news that I want to talk about here. So I've talked a fair bit over time about mass timber and engineered lumber, but one thing that I find, this story was actually given to me by one of my architectural spec reps, and this idea that we can use raw trees to replace, in some instances, engineered timber. And it's so funny because we talk about mass timber and engineered timber as a way to use a lot more of our timber waste. This article goes on to talk about how even with engineered wood, there is still a lot of waste being generated. In the US alone, annually, there are 55 metric tons of wood waste being generated from engineered timber production. What's interesting, though, is if for those watching the video, I'm just scrolling through a couple of furniture pieces and kind of mock-ups and things where essentially logs and specifically the first fork of a log or a tree is being used as a structural member. Well, this should really be no surprise to anyone who has paid attention to timber framing or construction techniques over the millennia. The idea of using that fork in a tree as a central as a truss, or as a truss in a building, is as old as the Vikings. This is as old as ancient Japanese temples. But now, with the use of AI, everyone's favorite word these days, basically just with the use of computers and structural modeling and things, we are able to use a lot more raw trees as structural members. It doesn't just have to be that opening truss on an A-frame home. It can be utilized in place of studs or in place of some mass timber construction. And really all you're doing is debarking the tree and generating even less waste. Now, this is a look all of its own. Certainly it could be pretty cool, but I could also see this style, this trend running its course pretty quickly. Possibly this software that the company that's talking about in here, I'm trying to remember the name of that company. It doesn't really matter. It's a company that is building software, whole tree structures. That's what it's called. They're building software that will allow you to create those structural calculations to determine how you can use the variety of trees, logs that you might have in your inventory. That could be great as exposed. What would happen if those were hidden in a normal wall assembly? Would we be able to generate structural members with less waste, better use of the tree, and not be kind of showing that out on display? Because that's the design trend that I can see very quickly going away. It is a very distinct taste. It's not a really contemporary look. I suppose it could be, but I could see a lot of architects getting really excited about it for a short period of time and then it going by the wayside. If this technique to utilize the tree in its raw form as a structural member could continue to be enhanced to the point where we go back to building like we used to by skinning a wall, a stud wall with something else, this could be particularly interesting. We'll see. I don't know. I found it was interesting just how everything old is new again, right? There are many examples of these timber frame buildings that essentially just use the crux of the tree, the fork in the tree. Now on to everything that is new again. I've talked a lot about impregnation and lignin removal, compression, all kinds of different ways that we're making wood stronger. Well, there's some new research that is basically trying to re-engineer wood from the nanoscale up. And a couple of school engineers from Florida Atlantic University have, for lack of a better term, impregnated cell walls with iron, nano-iron. They used potassium hydroxide and ferric nitrate to create a chemical reaction to create this crystalline iron substance that could be embedded in the cell walls at the molecular level and below at the atomic level, and essentially increase the strength of the cell walls at that nanoscale level. So they used an electron probing microscope to do like Jenga tests, and they discovered that at that level, at that nanoscale level, they were seeing greater strength in the cell wall without adding really very much weight at all, a negligible amount of weight. Well, at that core building block level, if you have added strength, just keep building onto that. Overall, at the macro scale, at the board level, you now have a stronger material without added weight. This is cool. It's way far off. Obviously, this is like at the university level, but it's this continued advancement in material science and interest in advancement in wood in material science that is particularly interesting to me. I could see this going somewhere, and it's starting to like cross over into some of the science fiction that I love to read, where you've got these like crazy materials that, there's a movie due to drop this summer, I think, called Project Hail Mary. It's the same guy that wrote The Martian, that movie that went so incredibly popular. Fantastic book, by the way, if you haven't read it. But there is a solid xenon material that's featured heavily throughout that book that basically reinvents society. And this is the type of thing that we're talking about here. By altering an existing material like wood at that nanoscale level, we still have wood. We still some of the same working properties with wood, but now we have something that's stronger without really changing the working properties. very interesting to see where this goes. I'm always interested in this kind of geeky stuff anyway, so hey, bring it on. I am all for that. So let's move on to my main topic, and that's kind of plantation forests versus the opposite, which we're just going to call natural forests. And this is spurred by a question from Michael regarding grade A teak. He says, while surfing Instagram, the algorithm believes I'm a prospective outdoor teak furniture customer. Accordingly, I'm getting a lot of sponsored accounts put in front of me, and I'm surprised by what seems really affordable teak furniture, but I'm skeptical that it is real teak. Perhaps a good topic. I agree, Michael, and I think this brings up a much larger question of where's the material coming from. And teak is a good example. Teak, Tectona grandis, is grown in a lot of regions of the world. You could say the same thing about genuine mahogany, Sweetina macrophylla. It is grown in Florida. It's grown in Fiji. It's grown in Central America. It's grown in South America. Teak is the same way. Indonesia, Java, of course, Myanmar, the genuine teak. We also find it in Chile and Costa Rica. Radiata pine, mostly known for plantations in New Zealand, but also in Chile and Argentina and Costa Rica as well. There are lots of similar climate zones around the world where you can introduce non-native species and grow them in a plantation. But just because teak from Indonesia is teak and teak from India or Africa is also Tectona grandis, is it exactly the same? And moreover, should it have the same dollar value attached to it? And the answer is yes, it's the same botanical species, in this case Tectona grandis, but it's really not the same species in practical nature. So let's take a step back and look at plantation versus natural forests. And what does that actually mean? And that's really kind of, well, my primary topic for today. Really, the main difference between a natural forest and a plantation is that a forest is, well, naturally occurring. It just happens. It's always been there, right? Well, it did start at some point and it grew up naturally, no intervention from man. So the converse of that is a plantation is a human managed area where trees are intentionally planted, usually in rows, usually of the same species. So this monoculture idea is very common to see. For those watching the video, here's an aerial shot of a eucalyptus plantation in Uruguay, South America, somewhere. And, very clearly there are trees in rows. It looks like a cornfield or a soybean field. It's just lots and lots of rows of trees. On the ground, you will see plantations just about everywhere where, again, trees are planted in rows. On the screen, I'm showing a birch plantation, and the trees are in nice, neat, ordered rows. Now, it should be said that oftentimes you can go into a natural forest and you can just standing anywhere in the forest, look back through the trees, and oftentimes you can make out rows and might think, oh, this is a plantation. You may also discover that it's not a plantation because as trees fall, that tree that is lying on the ground is known as a mother tree. Oftentimes, trees will sprout from that log as it decays. So the straight line formed by that fallen log can also sprout a straight line of trees that will often look like you're standing in a plantation. At the same time, though, just because it started life as a plantation doesn't mean that it can't mature or graduate to a natural occurring forest. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we move through this topic. So there can be plantations that are planted by man and continue to be replanted as the timber is felled. There are forests that just occur naturally with no replanting by man. And then there are planted forests that eventually stop being planted by man, stop being replanted, and kind of take on their own life, graduate into a natural forest. So in essence, plantations are tree farms. Like I said, like a row of corn, plantations are tree farms. What is the product they're producing? If it's lumber, then obviously they're trying to get taller trees. I've spoken about it on this episode before where there are 2x4 forests where they let the tree go just tall enough and wide enough in diameter to produce a couple of studs. And then you'll find slightly taller trees that are 2x6 forests and 2x10 forests and 2x10 forests, 2x12 forests. And then there are just trees that are specifically sold for lumber, like a lot of the hardwood plantations where they may let them grow 40 years before they're harvested. The whole idea and the management that happens of that managed forest is to produce a product. At the same time, you may have a pulp plantation where the turn rate is much, much higher, and they're not necessarily having to prune like they would for lumber producing, where you're trying to get a clear grade. You're just letting it grow absolutely wild, and you're cutting it down every couple of years. Palm oil plantations is a tree plantation where the product is the extracted from the tree and not the tree itself. Technically, a peach orchard or an apple orchard is a plantation forest where we're planting in neat rows and the product is the fruit from the tree, and the management of each individual tree is to propagate fruit. So we prune those branches to produce more flowering branches, which produces more fruit, more apples, more peaches, more pears per tree. It all depends upon what that product is. Plantations, yes, they're tree farms, but forests, naturally occurring forests, are very complex, self-sustaining ecosystems. And that's obviously one of the big knocks against plantation is they are monoculture, and they can often denude the soil, and the monoculture nature doesn't promote as diverse an ecosystem. This is changing. Some modern silvicultural methods and plantation forestry in general is allowing for introduction of a more diverse ecosystem, which, go figure, is actually promoting a hardier tree of that monoculture. And it's kind of that stepping stone from turning a plantation forest into a naturally occurring forest. One of the first steps is the introduction of additional species. Generally, plantation forests tend to be non-native species. And as you want to graduate into a natural forest, you start to introduce native species to help bolster the diversity in that particular forest. But let's talk a little bit about some stats here. I did some research and pulled some stuff up in my handy little iPhone notepad here. In the US alone, 36% of our total land area is forest. Around 25% of that is a natural forest, and the other 11% is planted. But primarily, like 8% of that 11 is found in the South, the southern yellow pine plantations that I'm talking about. And if you drive in the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, you will see neatly ordered rows. As you're whipping down I-95 at 75 miles an hour, you will be able to actually get this kind of repeating wave pattern if you go fast enough that the trees kind of stand still and you see those ordered rows all the way along. But as you move kind of west from the 95 corridor, you'll start to see this transition from plantation forest into naturally occurring forest. And you look at a lot of the forests in western Georgia, western South Carolina, many of those you could be mistaken as natural forests, but they actually started their life as plantations. Hundreds of years ago, we didn't do such great silviculture, and we did a lot of clear cutting. Those forests have been replanted. So as a planted forest, they were a plantation, but now they've been nurtured and managed to become its own self-sustaining ecosystem, aka a natural forest. So a lot of times people talk about old growth and first cut or second cut. Yes, it was possibly poor land management back in the 1800s that clear cut a lot of land. All that stuff has been replanted, and now those have become natural forests. So the stat that I don't have is of the 25% of the US that's covered in natural forest, how much of that is a second cut or third cut forest? Now, just because a forest is natural doesn't mean that it can't be logged, that it can't be managed for timber production. But the key differentiator there, I've said it a couple times, is a plantation is specifically replanted. We grow it to a certain age to meet whatever that product is, pulp, lumber, 2x4s, etc. We cut those trees down and then we replant in neat ordered rows. The same thing can be said in a natural forest, but when we cut down a tree, we're looking for feeder trees around that, 2 to 3 trees within the drip line of that tree, that when we cut down this bigger tree, the sunlight will help those feeder trees, feeding off the root system of that existing tree we took down, they will grow up and fill in that canopy. And this is the shelterwood silvicultural method or selective silviculture, mostly in hardwood forests where clear cutting isn't really the best way to do this. Selective clear cutting, you might make a case depending upon the species, but most of the time we're talking about shelterwood or selective silviculture, where we're removing that one tree, and the only way we remove that tree is if we have those 2 to 3 feeder trees around it. We're not replanting it. In fact, a lot of long-term studies have shown when we replant the natural forest, those seeds don't take off. The seedlings grow up and oftentimes provide more fuel for fire, provide more fuel for other parts of flora and fauna to take over and compete with the trees, and the overall forest suffers. You're introducing competition at the ground story level, which could affect the amount of nutrients going to the trees and the canopy. Whereas if you leave it alone and you let nature, feeder trees, take over and fill in holes in the canopy, the whole forest does better. You're not increasing the competition, you're leaving the playing field standard. Now, where that goes awry is when you start taking down trees that don't already have feeder trees around it. Now you've got a greater hole in the canopy, greater sunlight can come down and cause diversity, that diverse ecosystem, to sprout up and provide competition for those other trees. So what we found, and this is true in temperate forests, but also especially where most of the study is being done in tropical rainforests, if you take a tree down, there's a hole in the canopy. That forest will reclaim and seal up that hole in the canopy within 3 months, not years, 3 months. Those feeder trees take off and reach for that canopy and fill it in very, very quickly. No replanting going on there. So that's the important part when you see all these various companies that talk about replanting. For every dollar sold, we will plant a tree. Usually what's happening is they're selling those trees to a company like Weyerhaeuser or Georgia Pacific, and they're going into a plantation forest to grow stud trees, 2x6 trees, etc. Because the active replanting that is going on can, not always, can be harmful to a natural forest. Little technical difficulty. I'm in a massive thunderstorm right now, so my power just flickered. Anyway, let's move on to some other stats here. 36% of the land in the U.S. is forest. Globally, actually, I didn't grab the forest coverage globally, but 93% of the forests globally are natural forests. And that's kind of surprising because so much talk about plantation forestry these days, and only 7% of the global forest land is actually plantation. East Asia, no surprise, has the largest share of planted forest. So East Asia has about 36% of its total land area is plantation forest. Those are a lot of the teak plantations we're talking about, the palm oil plantations, the various mahogany type plantations, the Philippine mahogany plantation, and any number of secondary and tertiary species that are coming out of Asia, specifically Southeast Asia. Europe is second in the world as far as total plantation coverage, and about 30% of the land area in Europe is plantation. Makes sense. Age of industrialism. They cut a lot of trees down. They didn't have any left, so they replanted a bunch of stuff. Not mostly, 1/3 plantations. Western and Central Africa have the lowest share with only 1% being plantations. Interesting enough, that's like Spanish cedar and teak. Probably comprises all the plantations because of such rich tropical forests to begin with and native species that are already sought after. The replanting they're doing, they don't really have as much room because their natural forests are doing quite well. South America, like you might expect, like Africa, only about 2% of its land area is plantation forest. Again, with the tropical forests in the region, there's not really a whole lot of need to plant plantation species. What is plantation species, because of the tropical climate, they're pulling tropical species from Southeast Asia and planting them there. So about 2% is planted, but that brings the point. Around 18 to 19% of planted forests globally are composed of introduced species. Why? Why introduced species? Teak is the perfect example. Genuine teak grows in Myanmar or Burma when the British ruled it. What a great wood. Gained global popularity, and everybody thought, well, could we plant it? We have a similar climate to Myanmar. It's hot and wet in Southeast Asia. Well, it's hot and wet in Costa Rica. It's hot and wet in a lot of parts of South America. Let's grow it there. So there's now teak in India, in Indonesia, in Java, Sumatra, Costa Rica. Wow, all over South America at this point, and even places like Papua New Guinea, Vietnam, etc. They are introducing these species into Africa or into South America because there is already a market demand for them. And if we can increase the total land area that species grows on, all the better, right? So it just kind of, not only does it spread the wealth, but it's kind of the driving factor behind plantations for lumber. Let's introduce this species that's in this tiny little area in the globe, spread it out a little bit more, will provide more sustainable forestry over the long run. But again, let's talk about plantations as a starting point, because this is where that conversation is going. And again, even though, what did I say, only 11% globally? No, 7%. Even though only 7% globally are plantation forests, those plantations are doing some pretty incredible things as far as sustainable forestry. Plantation forests tend to have a much higher turn rate. And as those plantations have gone through multiple generations and produced fourth, fifth, sixth cuts, and if you're talking 40-year turn rate on some hardwoods, that could be 200, 250 years. And many of these plantations are now getting that old. But what's happening is they're turning those plantations more into natural forests. So when you start with a focus on timber production using fast-growing non-native species, you get that uniform spacing, a single or maybe a few species throughout, and a very even age structure. That's the important part. All the trees are of the same height. They're all growing up together, seeking the sun at the same time. Once you start to introduce other species, there'll be different ages, and you have to manage that forest for those different ages in order to produce timber products. So as you evolve towards a natural forest, it requires pretty intensive forestry management. And plantation will transition into a more complex ecosystem, aka diverse, but to get there, you have to thin. You have to start removing some of those planted trees that have grown up over time to allow space for the introduction of other species. And not just tree species, but other understory and even fauna as well to promote diversity in that ecosystem. Understory development is kind of the key of this, and this is just bushes and shrubs along the ground, but also fungal development. The fungal association that trees have with mushrooms and things like that and moss cannot be overstated. It is what makes trees so strong, that connection they have to their fungal associates down on the ground and under the ground. Rich, healthy trees have a lot of moss and lichen and mushrooms and stuff supporting their growth. And that's all understory development that comes from thinning as well, and introduction. Enrichment planting, where we're taking these native tree species, introducing those native tree species to continue to diversify. With those native tree species comes native fungal association, as well as native predators, both flora and fauna, that can help to not mutate, but enrich the introduced species. And then finally, you start moving away from planting and allow more natural regeneration. Trees are living things. They want to produce like all living things. And if you allow them to reproduce, you're going to get that regenerative cycle happening. But that's also going to promote different ages. You're going to have not only the canopy, but the understory and different levels, first and second story within that forest. And the silvicultural plan for that is totally different. It involves different ways of thinning, allowing sunlight to hit and promote growth of the first story and understory, while not necessarily sabotaging the canopy at the same time. And that's where diversity of species can help. Shade-tolerant trees are going to do well in that environment. Sun-seeking trees are going to go up and fill in holes in the canopy. They all have a balance, and it's all a matter of managing for that. So that's the point that I want to make, because I'm seeing that happen more and more. The radiata forestry, and I'm hoping to have a guest on the show relatively soon to speak to the radiata forestry in New Zealand, because it's kind of the gold standard of plantation. That is starting to see more and more graduation and evolving towards natural forests. Some of these enormous plantation forests are now quite diverse ecosystems. And that can also happen within the primary tree being radiata pine, but the introduction of other things, non-trees, like I said, in the understory, that can be really effective. But let's talk a little bit about what I hinted to at the beginning of this. It may be Tectona grandis, but it's grown all over the world, and therefore dramatically different price points. So are you not getting teak? Is it fake teak? No, the chances are in the teak market, it is real teak. But In a plantation, you could expect faster growth rate on the lumber. So what does that mean? It means lower density. It means wider spaced growth rings. It's going to mean probably a lighter color to it. Lower density woods are certainly going to be lighter than the deep, dark, dense jungle woods. Rapid growth in a controlled environment will also happen from massive pruning. If we prune the lower branches off, it reduces knots and produces clear wood, but it also reduces the nutrient-seeking kind of photosynthesis lower to the ground, and it forces the photosynthesis up into the canopy. It forces that tree to go straight up to get its nutrients from the sunlight up top, promoting long, straight bole and clear wood. But it grows up really, really fast, which means lower density and a lighter color there. You will find more uniformity from board to board in a plantation forest. Go into a natural forest and harvest, 3 walnut trees within the same acre, and you're going to have dramatically different color and grain characteristics in each one of those species, each one of those same species logs within a small area of the forest. Go to a plantation and cut down 3 trees of the same area of the same size, and you're going to find they're almost identical to one another. So for the architectural design community that I talk to these days, who wants everything to look the same, they want it all to look like plastic, plantation forestry can be a good solution for you. There's just the way they're cultivated, they're all growing up at the same rate, they're all getting the same nutrients, the same amount of sunlight, same kind of soil chemistry throughout. And this is that bad side of the monoculture thing. Remember that story I talked about with the plantation forests in Uruguay and Paraguay, and how the forest floor was basically like the moon. That can promote very bland looking trees. I also think the lighter color overall due to lower density means that some of the other colors within the tree that you normally wouldn't see are allowed to come out. So teak is very high in oil and extractive content. And when you first mill it, it can be pink and green and gray and cream and yellow and brown. But as it oxidizes and it mellows, it goes back to that deeper honey brown color. Plantation teak from places like Costa Rica or Indonesia will be much, much lighter in color, and those undercolors, those subtones, the pinks and the light greens and the creams, are allowed to show through more because the overall base color is much, much lighter. It's not that deep dark brown, so you can see all those other colors. So the teak from those faster grown plantations kind of looks streaky and spotty and multicolored all the time. Like even after it oxidizes, you'll still see a lot of that because the overall base tint is quite a bit lower. Also with that comes lower extractive contents, more of the things that produce the crazy colors, but also some of the things that promote like what makes teak such a great exterior wood. The silica content in it, all the oils and resins in it that makes it such a great yacht quality wood. If that's not there, if the soil chemistry or the fast growing high water content nature has essentially caused all those minerals and all those extractives to leach out of the wood because of the excessive rainfall, you end up with teak, but teak that isn't as water resistant or as durable as teak from Myanmar. With that, I did talk about presence of knots. Sorry, I'm reading off my bullet points here. Presence of knots going to show up a lot more in a plantation because of the fact that the trees are all growing up together and allowed to branch out. Now we're pruning those, but you will still see those knots. They tend to be more pin knots than like full-on larger knots, but you'll definitely see more of those in plantation. In fact, a lot of plantation lumber these days is graded based on the number of knots. It's based on an appearance grade rather than a cutting grade like NHLA. It's like a European grade, like first European quality, FEQ, which will only allow, I think, like 2 knots per an 8-foot board on one face. Oh, on both faces for FEQ. The lesser grade will allow 2 knots on one face. With this fast-growing, kind of somewhat leached out nutrient tree, we have more susceptibility to disease and pests. Also, that's the monoculture thing. Imagine, we've talked about the emerald ash borer. Imagine a forest that's nothing but ash trees. Well, when that ash borer comes in, it takes out the entire forest. There's no hardy oaks there that can shrug off the emerald ash borer. There's no pine trees that are completely ignored by the ash borer. The entire forest can be gone in seconds. And that's what's happening, not in seconds, really quickly. That's what's happening out in the Mile High West with the pine beetle. It's a native species, but all those trees are becoming stressed, and the pine beetles are taking out the entire forest. There is a fair bit of potential in a plantation forest, though. I feel like I'm talking only negative. Positives is, from an engineered wood perspective, plantation timber is great to be processed into plywood or glue lambs. Any strength trade-off you might get from a lower density tree can be counteracted by cross-laminated timber or just glue lamb timber. The turn rate is really high. The appearance and the knots is really not that big of a deal. The smaller size, which I haven't really mentioned, maybe that goes without saying, but plantation forests tend to much have a higher turn rate, and they're smaller diameter trunks. You're not getting the 24, 36 diameter trunks. They're like 12 to 18 inches in a good plantation forest. So that smaller stuff can still be ground up or sliced and diced and turned into a glue lamb or a chipboard or something like that. This is where really engineered wood products should come from. And this is where plantations are doing God's work right now. Let's not take our old growth forests. Let's not take our natural forests and chop those trees down and then, chew them up and spit them out and turn them into turbite bark particle board. Let's take the lower quality, the smaller trees that are being purpose grown and turn them into plywood, particle board, OSB, and even mass timber construction. And mass timber is softwood, faster grown softwoods for that matter. That natural resistance issue is something that really can't be overstated. It's not just a monoculture thing, but that rapid growth leads to much lower density, but also ring density within an annual year. Between early and late growth, you find very little difference there. So in certain species, that kind of compromises the tree's ability to compartmentalize infection, which is just totally common in old growth timber. Like if you get a gash in the bark on an old growth tree, it shrugs it off. It compartmentalizes that. It saps over it. It shuts it off. Sometimes can turn into a burl. Sometimes it just dies while the rest of the tree thrives. Without those natural divisions between early and late growth, the tree is not able to throw up that wall and compartmentalize off that infection. And very quickly, that infection can go through the entire tree. It's like, I'm sorry, this is the first thought that pops into my head, but like they talk about cancer. Once it gets into the lymphatic system, that's bad because the lymphatic system transports it through the entire body really, really quickly. In a plantation tree, there's not as many subsystems and checks and balances in place to prevent widespread infection throughout a tree. So a tiny little gash, look at it this way, they're immunocompromised. That's the best way to look at it. Tiny little gash over here on the tree can pass and infect the entire tree within a single growing season. And that's one of the reasons that plantation forests have to be actively managed, because infections have to be cut off literally right away before they have a chance to spread throughout a tree and from one tree to the next tree. Plantation forestry is very labor intensive. It is definitely not plant them in rows and come back in 20 years, come back in 40 years and cut them down. It requires active day in and day out management, exactly the same way a cornfield would. In fact, you might find cornfields are less labor intensive because of the harvest. The turn rate is 3 times a year? I'm not a farmer, but I know that there's early corn and late corn and Indian corn. I don't know, but most of the cornfields around me in Maryland harvest 3 times a year. There can only be so much management, yes, it's a lot in the course of a year, but the same type of management is happening over a 10-year cycle, over a 20-year cycle, over a 40-year cycle in each one of these. So I think that's kind of the definition, if you will, the difference between a natural forest and a plantation forest. They serve a very viable resource for us, and I can imagine that the percentage of plantation forests will continue to grow. As long as it's not at the risk of our natural forests, the age of deforestation, while it's not dead, it's definitely on the wane. And if you look at long-term graphs, you'll see the rise in plantation forestry spiked because we had a lot of replanting that needed to be done from poor forestry techniques. Well, we filled in those spaces. And now it's like, okay, well, where do we plant a plantation now? And that's where we get into afforestation methods, where there wasn't a forest there before and we're creating a forest. And that's where things can go particularly bad, like we talked about in Uruguay and Paraguay and those monoculture kind of thumbprint forests. We still have a finite amount of land. And with so much of our forested land being natural forests, the key becomes managing our natural forests for what they're good for really high quality lumber, for a little bit more high end luxury lumber, hardwood lumber, even higher end softwood lumber. Where do the lower end products come from? Where should they come from? They should probably come from managed plantation forests. And the largest demand that you'll find in the wood products industry can be filled by these plantation forests over such a tiny area, right? 7% of the global forest area is 7%. And yet the radiata forestry in New Zealand has way more trees than they can possibly export right now. And their forests are stronger and hardier than they were 40 years ago. The turn rate has gone up. The number of new trees has gone up. The optimization of those forests has gone through the roof. And like I said, I should have an expert joining me on the show relatively soon. I've already talked to him about all this stuff, which is why I'm kind of excited about what's happening down there. But natural forests, like up in Canada, I've talked about how there's more Western red cedar today than there was 20, 30, 50 years ago. And that's effective forestry management. That is a natural forest, but it's not being replanted, but proper silviculture is allowing that forest to thrive to the point where now we need to actively start thinning it. And that's where these wildfire issues in this healthy forest, like my healthy forest episode, really comes into bear. Same thing in the US, where we've left these trees alone. They're regenerating all on their own. Now we need to start thinning. So yes, we need to thin our plantation forests if we want them to graduate into natural forests. We also need to thin our natural forests to keep them from being wiped out by bugs and wiped out by fire. Ultimately, forest management, it's universal, whether it's a plantation or a naturally occurring forest. I personally am excited to see further strides in plantation forestry, but I expect that number, that global number, to probably go up a little bit more. Maybe we'll get as high as 10, 12%. And then I expect it to start declining slowly over time as those plantation forests become recategorized as natural forests. And if we continue to do it right, I don't think plantations are ever going to go away because, like I said, they serve their purpose and they serve a really good purpose. But it'll be curious to see what can happen as more and more plantations become classified as natural forests. And what does that do to the optimization of the plantation teak or the radiata teak? So when you're looking at that teak furniture catalog and you're wondering, why is this stuff so cheap? Where did it come from? And they will probably proudly tell you from an environmental perspective, our wood is not from Myanmar. Our wood is African. Our wood is Indonesian. We're seeking plantation teak. Great. Well, plantation teak could be from a lot of different places. And I will tell you, North Indian plantation teak is different from South Indian plantation teak, which is dramatically different from Costa Rican teak. I will tell you, Costa Rican and a lot of South American teak does not have the same oil content as the Indian, African, and Southeast Asian. So from a boat building perspective, it's not the same wood. It doesn't have that water proofedness or repellency that you will find. The trees tend to be a little bit smaller. You get a little bit more crystalline kind of white streaks throughout because they're cutting closer and closer to the pith due to the smaller diameter of the trees. I think the Central and South American teak plantations just are too young. They need another 40, 50, 100 years to mature into multi-generational plantation forests, whereas Indian teak forests, Vietnamese teak forests, Indonesian teak forests are almost indiscernible from the Myanmar teak. Almost. Depends where you get it from, depends upon how that plantation is managed. Just like anything, there's going to be bad Indian teak and bad Indonesian teak, but there's also going to be phenomenal Indian teak and phenomenal Indonesian teak. And basically, if you're looking for the good stuff, just find a supplier that really knows their teak and visits all these forestries and understands how they're growing them, how they're managing them, what silvicultural methods they're doing. More importantly, what are their cutting grades? When are they cutting? What is their turn rate? How are they grading the material? All of that is going to have a massive impact on the price. And I think you'll find the really, really cheap, let's just say inexpensive teak furniture let's face it, a lot of it is just cheap too. A lot of that is coming from plantations that are not producing the quality of teak that like you would want to use for boat building or for exterior purposes. But for interior furniture purposes, cool. In fact, that's awesome. Let's take the stress off the teak forests for interior purposes, and let's use teak from plantation forests that don't need that water resistance. And let's use the good teak, the true exterior grade teak for exterior applications like cladding and decking and boat building. That's really where the plantation thing becomes exciting. Like I said, purpose-built, purpose-grown forests for studs, purpose-grown forests for interior teak applications where, let's face it, let's not waste the exterior teak for a coffee table, right? And I think the same thing would apply with eucalyptus, would apply for Spanish cedar, Afrormosia, so many of the mahoganies, the genuine mahoganies, even the African and African generically, like Sapele, Udall, and African mahogany. Some of those plantations are serving a great role and letting the real stuff, the genuine stuff, do what it does well from an exterior species and let the plantation stuff fill in the other gaps. It's a fine line sometimes. In black and white, is it planted? Is it naturally regenerating? That's the true definition. But they all serve purposes. One is not bad, one is not good, and I think we need both of them for the future of forestry on this planet. Sustainability, environmentally, however you want to, manufacturing consistency, however you want to slice it and dice it, they both serve accurate roles, and they help each other by taking the stress off of what natural forests do well and what plantation forests do well. With that plantation talk out of the way, let's move on to some drying questions. There never seems to be an end to the question about drying, or for that matter, the questions about bugs, so I'll just keep answering them. First, I got a question from Vaughn, and I like this because he's calling me out. He says, I feel like I'm getting conflicting advice from you. You got me all excited about air-dried lumber and how much nicer it is than kiln-dried. I have visions of silky smooth, buttery, melt-in-my-mouth wood that will make my chisels compete to be in my hand. Recently, though, you seem to be mentioning bugs frequently. Well, you guys keep asking about them, so how kilns are the only way to be sure to get rid of bugs, and how they could be in egg form and not obvious. So how can I judge my risks of holding an air drying path, or if I need to find a kiln? I'm dealing with a red oak tree that died, for reasons unknown, on a friend's property a couple of years ago. Last year I had it milled and it's drying in a storage unit. Next year I hope to make a workbench out of it, so it's going to end up in my shop where I can keep an eye on it. But I'm not excited about unleashing bugs in my shop to eat the other wood that I have stored. So I hear where you're coming from, Vaughn. And in the past, I do believe that I've made kind of a love letter to air-dried material. It is certainly a pleasure to work with. But it's not that much night and day different than kiln-dried. The really crazy workability is in the green stuff. Air-dried and kiln-dried, and air-dried properly down to equilibrium moisture content will still be easier to work, but buttery, smooth, transformative, I can't really say that would be the case. The real advantage to air drying is some greater color variation. A lot of kind of crazier colors in certain species will really be mellowed out by kiln drying, and specifically like dehumidification kiln drying, as opposed to solar kiln drying, where you're holding a temperature for multiple days. And that's the bug killer. Holding a temperature for 48 to 72 hours is what's required to make sure all the bugs are dead. Where solar kilns fail on that is they can achieve some of the same temperatures, but there's obviously that sunset cycle. As the sun goes down, the kiln temperature goes down. The higher the R value of your kiln, obviously the longer it will hold on to that temperature. But you can't really like shoot it way up and rely on the R value to keep that temperature high, because if you go too high on the temperature, you're going to cause some damage, some cell collapse, possibly combustion. So solar kilns can still reach those temperatures, and in many instances can hold them for 10 to 12 hours. While technically that won't, like in a commercial In a commercial nature, if I'm selling wood, and especially if wood is crossing the border and it needs a phytosanitary certificate, I couldn't do that with a solar kiln. If I were drying my own material and I'm keeping an eye on my own material and I'm working with it and can watch out for bugs, I would feel pretty comfortable about using a solar kiln for that. So there's the first thing for you, Vaughn. You could potentially go to a solar kiln and get a less stressed board that's kind of a compromise between full-on dehumidification kiln and air drying. But just because we've air dried the board doesn't mean that it's going to be rampant with bugs. If there are bugs in the tree already, yeah, you do want to try to get rid of them. We can use chemical treatments, borax treatments, and things like that. Yes, that is an ingestive treatment, so the active bugs will eat it and will then die, but you will have to treat it again, and it is recommended for that egg cycle to treat it again 6 months later, so that any eggs that hatched after that first round will eat the stuff and will die again. That does work. It just means that you got to do it again in 6 months. And you need to keep a close eye on the material and look for boreholes, look for active piles of sawdust to make sure that there aren't things boring in there. If you do see that, a borax treatment will fix that, will help that. And then again, just continue to pay attention to it and you can treat it again. Ideally, that 2 times egg cycle treatment will kill the active bugs that are laying the eggs. And then when those eggs hatch, you'll kill those bugs before they lay more eggs. And you should be fine after 2 treatments. But it's one of those things to just kind of keep an eye out for. If, however, you're using a species of wood that was felled in the summer and it is full of sap and sugar, the bugs are going to keep coming for it. Even if you've killed, round 1 and round 2 of those bugs, you still have a sugary sweet snack that bugs may find their way to and may go after. So it is something you need to be aware of. Kiln drying at a higher temperature and holding of the temperature will bake off a lot of that excess extractive. Not all of it. We're not thermally modifying here, but it will kind of make it a less appetizing meal for the bugs. So there are more options than to just stick it in a dry kiln for 48, 72 hours at high temperature and still ending up with something that will work. Because you're dealing with a tree that was possibly standing dead, it came down for unforeseen reasons, it could have a bug issue. So now that you've milled it and it's air drying in the storage unit somewhere, take a look at it, inspect it. If all, as a belt and suspenders measure, possibly give it a chemical borax treatment or some sort of wood bug commercial product treatment, and then do it again in 6 months, and you'll probably be fine. Red oak, certainly powder post beetles is a big deal, and red oak can be particularly appetizing to those little buggers. So it is something to keep an eye out for. But it does not mean that you absolutely must kiln dry or you're gonna be doomed. But I also will tell you that, yes, it does work better, but I bet there's a lot of people out there that I could put air-dried red oak and kiln-dried red oak in front of, and they wouldn't really immediately know the difference. If you've worked with a lot of the material, you might be able to tell the difference, but there's also a lot of other variables in there, like the makeup of the tree itself and how the tree grew and the density of the growth rings that could dramatically affect a lot of that stuff. The one thing I will say, and let me go back to his email here to make sure that I'm quoting it correctly here. He said that he had that red oak milled and it's drying in a storage unit. What do you mean by that? Go back to that storage unit. Does it have some sort of ventilation, or is it just there drying very, very slowly? If it's drying very, very slowly, you might have to worry about things like mold more than anything. Depending upon your climate, that could be a real issue. I would definitely check on that storage unit and try to get some fans in there that can circulate air to help slow that down, or speed up that drying, but also to remove that excess moisture. That excess moisture could create mold and fungus, which again could generate a fair bit of staining on your wood, could also generate food to attract more bugs, which could lay more eggs. So you don't want to just, low and slow is great, but to a point. Ventilation is the key for drying wood. So I would take a look at that and make sure you've got some ventilation on that material. Next in the drying saga, I have a question from Andrew, who I think we could just call him Andrew Dick Prinicky, because here's a guy who is timber framing up in Alaska, and he's got a couple of problems he's dealing with. And, for those of you listening to this, you might want to go over to YouTube because I'm going to flash some really cool pictures that he shared with me. It's story time with Andrew here. Let's see. Andrew says, my wife and I own a 70s homestead in the interior of Alaska, about 150 miles west of Fairbanks, and recently decided it was time to upgrade from our little squirrel-infested black spruce log cabin on a remote property to something more inspiring. And there's a picture of the hammer beam assembly that he and his friends built. I dabbled in timber framing a few times with small projects, but we thought it'd be fun to make an entire building as a timber frame, especially with some hammer beam bents. If you're not familiar with the hammer beam, it's frankly one of my favorite styles of trusses. Very, very cool. Nice work on that one, Andrew. My wife and I are both pilots. We fly ourselves and our 3 little kids to the lake on floats in the summer and skis in the winter. The closest village is about 50 miles away with no roads. There's a cool picture of his hammer beam assembly with his plane on the frozen lake. How freaking cool is that? And that's why I call him Dick Prinicky. Closest village is 50 miles away, no roads. We have no neighbors except the furry kind. So some of my friends of mine asked me to take down a few ponderosa pine trees in Oregon, and I ended up with a windfall of beautiful pine wood. 3 pine trees around 32-inch diameter at the base, 120 to 130 feet tall with lots of clear wood. I milled those into over 100 beams to make the timber frame for our lake house. If anyone wonders why I didn't use local timber, just have them look at the average size of an Alaskan black spruce. If you're not familiar with black spruce, it's the scrawniest Christmas tree you will ever see. It makes Charlie Brown's Christmas tree look full and happy. They're not big trees. They don't get particularly wide diameter. There are log cabins made out of them, but they're really small diameter type logs. It's not the tree for timber framing. And traditionally in this type of environment, you would fell trees right on the property and use that for timber framing. So the crux of Andrew's situation is he didn't have that ability. He doesn't have the trees local, and he's having to bring them up from the Pacific Northwest, Oregon specifically. So I soon discovered the problem here, and that green pine is very, very heavy. And I had to be able to fit all my building materials, beams, shiplap, doors, windows, trim, etc., in a 40-foot shipping container with a 40,000-pound limit. I now have a kiln, but this is before that. In my hillbilly method, I stacked and stickered the pile of beams in an area of my shop, heated it to around 100 degrees, and ran household dehumidifiers around the clock. I tracked the weight of the samples in the stack and the amount of water coming out of the dehumidifiers and figured I shaved off around 1,000 pounds out of an 18,000-pound stack. Not amazing, but it definitely helped my weight requirements for the containers. Very old school, but that worked. But now, fast forward to today, I have a pro dehumidification kiln. I built a container for it. It's roughly 9 by 9 and 22 feet long. I've only dried 1-inch pine and Doug fir stock, but I've been amazed at how effective it is. But now I'm looking at another project, which is really where this question comes from. I'm going to be milling and shipping a large number of beams up to Alaska, again, similar remote type space. So I've seen some sources that claim most of the timber frame industry doesn't bother too much with kiln drying, given the difficulty of effectively drying something that massive. Is this true? If it's being done in the industry, what kinds of kilns and kiln schedules are people using to do it? And what would be the best way to dry around 2,000 board feet per load, a 6x8s, 8x8s, 8x10s, etc., in my dehumidification kiln? Assuming Doug fir and ponderosa are the species I'd work with, is their particular drying schedule to be beneficial to follow given the large size? So easy answer to that last question is not really, because it is true. Most of the timber frame industry doesn't get too caught up in kiln drying because in large part it's unnecessary. There are structural instances of timber framing, like exposed beams inside the cabin that maybe you want for appearance grade, and you may want to dry those because it's going to be in a climate controlled space. Those places, those are few and far between. Those are like a couple exposed beams in like a great room. Those are using radio frequency vacuum kilns. So think of a vacuum, you suck the air out and you lower the boiling point of water, and then you pound it with radiation like a microwave, radio frequency, that excites the molecules and causes that water to boil off in a very safe environment. You can kiln dry all the way through a timber. Instead of just kind of 2 inches deep, you get it all the way through to a consistent, homogeneous moisture content. That's great. It can be expensive. It also can be highly limited by the size of the kiln. Oftentimes, length is your biggest factor. Sucking the air out of a really, really long container is not easy to do. Just ask NASA. It's not easy to do. So oftentimes those containers tend to be shorter. And again, this is where you're seeing room-sized beams that are exposed and maybe not necessarily structural in nature. And you can put in a 12, maybe 14-foot beam and get away with that. If you're looking for 18, 20, 22 footers, there's not a lot of RF kilns out there in that size. There could be a few, but it's going to be rather expensive to pull that off. But it's really not necessary. Most timber frame structures will check. Boxed heart timber, where the pith, the heart of the tree, is centered in that cant, in that beam, means that it's going to check on all 4 faces, and you actually end up with a much more stable timber. It starts to build up tension as it dries, and because that pith is right in the center, it checks evenly on all 4 faces, releasing that tension, releasing that stress on the log, and you actually still end up with, say it's an 8x8, it's a square 8x8 when it's green. As it dries and checks on all 4 faces, you have a drier yet still square 8x8 timber. Whereas free of heart center beams, FOHC beams, will dry and may not check as much, but you can end up with a parallelogram due to the anisotropic nature of wood. So most timber framers, especially in those larger 8x8s and such, even 6x6s, they're sawing boxed heart material and not worrying about drying it, letting it dry on its own and letting it check to produce a tension, maybe not free, but less tension, more stable beam. But the weight issue is a real factor. When you are building near civilization where you have access with trucks and things, it's just a matter of loading onto the truck, and as long as you're passing your weight limits on your highways, you can get it up there. Many instances, trees are felled locally and logs are delivered to the site, in which case the log is then milled into the timber needed right there on the site. And the weight, yes, it's still heavy, but it's a matter of moving it from the sawmill, 100 feet over to the structure and going from there. And that's traditionally how this is done. In your instance, no roads in, no roads out. Can't fly it in. You'd need a hell of a helicopter or plane to airlift that stuff in. So somehow you're getting up there in a container. It must have some sort of road access. But the weight is a major factor. I do think what you did before could be pretty effective as a way of dropping off some of that moisture. You could air dry these. Timbers are a great opportunity for gravity drying. So build yourself kind of an A-frame structure and stack those beams vertically. So you've got one leaning one way at like 60 degrees, then you put one on the other side and you've got them at 60 degrees. Imagine like timber framing out an A-frame structure there. Putting them up on end like that will allow the free water to drain right out the bottom. You get big puddles and mud underneath those beams. Occasionally flip the beam over, move it out of the puddle, make sure there's not water pooling under it, because the beam will reabsorb that moisture via capillary action. So keep the area dry underneath it. You'll be able to drain a significant amount of moisture out of those beams. Depending on when they were felled, ponderosa pine can be, like if it's felled in the summer, it's going to be particularly obstinate because that sap is going to be stopping up a lot of the draining. So if you felled it in the winter and you don't have a lot of sap in there, gravity drying can be quite effective. You can also build a makeshift kiln. If you've got to put all this stuff in a container, load it into the container, and provide some ventilation in there, stick it in the sun, and you could create somewhat of a solar kiln. Now be cautious of this. You need to have the ability to vent that container quickly if it gets too hot. So I don't honestly know that much about shipping containers other than when I see at the lumber yard every single day, and those are traditional, rail car shipping containers, but they do have venting ports on them on, essentially small doors that you could open. So you open the end, you load the material in, and you could open a door like a human-sized door on the top of it, depending on how you rotate that container to allow venting. So you could close that door, stick it in the sun, and allow that to rise temperature pretty quickly. Then open that top door and push a fan in there that's going to move moisture in and out the top. That could actually be similar, probably more efficient to the, what'd you call it, the hillbilly method of drying that you did before. That could significantly reduce at least a couple thousand pounds from that load for you. That would be what I recommend. The important part here is you're drying this for no other reason than to drop weight. You're not really going to affect any issues here with workability or stability or anything like that. And that's why most of the time the timber frame community doesn't bother, because it's not necessary for what they're doing. In your case, you've got to drop weight. You got to make weight, coach. So that's what I would recommend. Use that container to your advantage as a solar kiln. As far as kiln schedules go, I mean, it's going to be the similar schedules you would see per species, but you're going to see those schedules don't go up above about 16 quarter. Low and slow is the way to go, the thicker you get. But the problem when you're getting into 8x8s, 32 quarter, 64 quarter, etc., is all bets are off, and there really is no kiln schedule anymore because A, not enough people are doing it, and B, there's just too many variables at play and too high of a risk of cell collapse, case hardening, etc., that can go on. Softwoods are going to be a little bit more amenable to that. They don't have the same structure that is prone to case hardening like oak and such, but I still think that you're going to be focused on gravity drying to remove, I would say, 10 to 15% of the moisture content. And then that, I'm just keep going with your term, hillbilly method. I like that. Sorry if I'm offending the hillbillies, but you're probably taking notes. All you hillbillies out there are taking notes about this. Pack that container, let it heat up, vent it via the top, and use one of those giant fans to push air through. I think you'd be quite surprised at how well that would work it. Once you get it up to the site where you have your dry kiln, I wouldn't put it in the dry kiln. There's really no reason for that unless you're looking for non-structural aesthetic beams that aren't going to check as much in a climate-controlled environment. Otherwise, it's just not necessary, which is why there's really not a lot of industry guidance around this outside of the RF vacuum kiln. That's really the only solution for drying really, really large timbers like that. Great question, Andrew. Good luck with that project. I hope you'll let us know how it goes. I'd love to know how much weight you actually save by drying with that container method. And I want to know what you're building. You said you've got a new project, but you haven't said what it is yet. So please, you shared great pictures before. I'm counting on you to share great pictures this time around. And with that, I'm at the end of my questions for the week. Thanks, guys, for great questions and allowing me to kind of keep somewhat of a theme going here. Again, if you have questions, go to lumberupdate.com. You'll find the show notes here, but you'll also find contact forms that you can send in questions or email me at lumberupdate@gmail.com. Look me up on Instagram, say hi, like my posts, do all that fun stuff at Lumber Update Show. And in the meantime, folks, go buy some lumber. Go buy some plantation lumber or go buy some natural forest lumber. Buy one of each and compare the appearance. And I'd be curious to hear from anybody out you. I said this before. If you have experience with natural forest versus plantain forest, what species, what were your thoughts? What was the workability like? Please share right into the show and let me know what you have to say. Thanks so much, everybody. Go buy some lumber.